Welcome to, I think this is our fourth roundtable that we've been having over the last several months. Super excited about this one, not just because of the subject matter, but also our guests, Mark and James, are phenomenal storytellers. And so I think you're going to find this session super engaging. They just have so many examples that'll really bring this narrative to life. I think in a different way, talking about some recent events and newsworthy articles on the topic of executive engagement on emerging risk, and talk through some of the critical questions that boards and executive teams have been asking, and discussing the way forward with regard to, I think, most of what we've been engaged about, with customers and with the broader community is that sometimes emerging risk can be compartmentalized. And so how do we open that up and really make it more of an organizational discussion from top to bottom, really all facets of the organization. So I'm Paula Fontana. I lead marketing here at Illuminar. And I'm joined here by, as I said, just two of the most phenomenal storytellers in this space, James Green, who is the founder of Illuminate Advisory, and Mark Heywood, who is creative director of Ink Jockey. Do you both want to say a few words, just in your experience, specifically as it relates to executive engagement before we get started?
So hi, everybody. My name's Mark Heywood. I was for many years a practitioner in the operational resilience space, mainly in financial services, but I can see that we've got a number of different verticals online. So I'll try and expand the range of my anecdotes that I'll share with you today. But these days, I'm no longer a practitioner. I'm an advisor, and I also divide my time between the world of operational resilience and the world of film and television. So story has always been at the heart of everything I've ever done. And it's a real pleasure to be working with James and Paula. So I hope you get a lot out of the next hour or so.
I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that I'm a consultant and also considered a storyteller. So most of you know me, my name is James Green. I am the co-founder of Illuminate Advisory based in Florida in the United States. And I've spent a lot of time the last 2 years just kind of working with boards of mid-sized to large companies, exploring what risk means to them as a company specifically.
Thank you both. Really excited about this topic, as I mentioned, and I woke up this morning to this particular piece from the Wall Street Journal. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll pop a link in the chat, but essentially describing why AI risk is keeping boards up at night. And I felt like this was such an articulate way of describing some of the nuance and the challenge that we're seeing in organizations around how we effectively manage risk. And the gist of the article is really around how company directors are trying to skill up in areas that they don't necessarily have the technical aptitude to really know. And effectively, a lot of these decisions, as we all know, are being made from the top down, especially as it relates to AI. And I just found it to be such an interesting articulation of the challenge that we've had around making these connections to our leadership teams as it relates to risk and resilience. And just, I know, James, you haven't had a chance to read the article. You've been tied up in other things. But maybe Mark, I know you had a chance to read it. What were some of the reflections that and takeaways that you sparked your interest around this specific topic?
Well, just on that specific headline there, Paula, why AI risks are keeping board members up at night. I think if they're not, then you're probably not worrying about it enough. But one of the reflections I had was, if you look at the history of senior management organizations in any organization over the last number of years, traditionally you had your chief information officer. And then that seemed to split into two, didn't it? You had a chief information officer and then maybe also a chief technology officer. And then it split further into a CISO. as cyber became more prevalent. I think it is inevitable that there will be a further schism into having a chief AI officer at some point because of the way that this risk and also opportunity is developing. I think it's important that we don't just get carried away with the risk, because there are massive opportunities and advances that can be utilized from this. But I think what you're going to see is that further division of what was traditionally only ever a CIO's responsibility into yet another component part, which itself is understandable, but also could, if these things aren't joined up, lead to even more separation and potential risk. James, I don't know whether you would agree with that, but I think a chief AI officer, it's going to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, your executive team reflects what's important to the company and also what is going on in the world. So as a lot of companies after or as they got hit with ransomware or had ransomware scares, to your point, you saw the CISO go maybe a layer down to direct to the CEO. And now in some companies after the fact, dotted line to the board. In 2020, when diversity was top of mind with a lot of companies, you had a chief diversity officer. And now a lot of those have gone away. So I would expect, with AI being top of mind, it's all everyone talks about, it's on the news all the time, you're going to see boards are asking those questions and saying, hey, what are we doing about this? And who's responsible for this? So you probably are going to have companies that start to have C-levels with AI in the title. That's always happened in business. Whatever the most important thing is to our business right now, we usually have an executive with that title to, that reflects that.
Yeah.
I thought some of these statistics from the article were interesting. So this is going back to 2023, which feels about 10 years ago at this point, but 95%, and this is from the NACD, which is the largest trade group for board directors. So in 2023, 95% of directors said that they believed that the increased adoption of AI tools would affect their businesses, while 28% said it wasn't yet discussed regularly. And I thought that was just such an interesting kind of articulation of kind of where the board sits with regard to AI risk at that time. And now I think we're beginning to see this bubble up differently with regard to, oh, wait, maybe I thought I had this, but maybe I don't. And how do I effectively not only embrace the potential and the opportunity around AI, but also mitigate some of the risks, right? And I know we've been seeing a number of issues kind of pop up in the space around whether it be AI hallucination, whether it be considerations around IP or employees improperly using AI tools, not necessarily being trained on how or skilled up in terms of how to use these tools appropriately. And all sorts of considerations around governance and policy. And what are the things that the two of you really think that the folks on the phone should be focused on with regard to helping skill up their boards or their executive teams on the nuances of AI risk?
Point I would make to a board that's included in that 28% said it wasn't yet discussed regularly would be that if we're not discussing it regularly internally, then we certainly have absolutely no idea what our third-party relationship management vendor base is doing with regard to AI, where traditionally the bulk of our risk has been held. So it's not just about understanding what's our own opportunity and our own risk appetite with regards to AI, and is that under governance? To what extent does that come onto your vendors? I know we're going to talk about CrowdStrike at some point, but CrowdStrike, I'm not saying that was an AI issue, but CrowdStrike would have sailed through every single third-party vendor management risk assessment process on the planet without exception. So I think what I would be encouraging a board to do is say, it's not just about us guys. We are reliant on a huge number of vendors, and we should, if we're doing this properly, treat it like any other risk as a part of any other risk management process and say, we need to incorporate the entire vendor base in all of this. So that 28% is really telling, because that's a lot of risk that's being not managed at the moment.
For me, I think the first thing is when boards are asking me around, or executives are asking me about AI, it's not the risk of AI, it's the opportunity of AI. Can we use LLMs to replace customer service? Can we use LLMs to replace our call center, to replace our online chat for entry-level decision-making? So you're starting to see some private equity firms and some investment firms. Can we use AI to analyze a company's 10Ks and public statements and all of that, instead of having a junior analyst do that work for us? So that's I think the first thing that I would want the audience to think about is, boards are asking me not first about the risk of AI. The first question is, what can we use AI for? The second question is then, what is the risk of AI? So as a risk professional, if you go in and tell your executives, well, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do this, they'll just find someone to say yes. But we first need to look at, as new tools, the cloud was going to change the world, and crypto was going to change the world, and now AI is going to change the world. There will be a next thing in 2 years that we're all talking about that's going to change the world. And yes, we need to look at the risk of whatever that next great thing is, but also what are the business opportunities? Because that's the, a lot of these boards, Mark, you made a joke before we went on the air, but it is true. How can we improve the bottom line? What are we doing in relation to our competitors? That's the first set of questions that are being asked. And then it's, what are the ramifications? What are the implications? Are there risk?
Mark, do you want to chime in here? I see you got a couple of questions in the chat.
Mark Armour calling you out.
Mark Armour.
There's 2 Marks in the call, so I just want to make sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries. Yeah, so Mark, I think I heard you say that perhaps the day of the chief AI risk officer is not far behind. So I guess my question is, does that not take us down a path of over specialization and treating AI kind of like its own set of risks, when really those risks are no different than the risks we experience from other sources, just maybe more amplified?
Yeah, 100%. Because what it doesn't cater for is that ever-present Gartner statistic that over 70% of most technology budgets are spent supporting legacy tech, which is where the bulk of your entire risk is sitting. And what that does is it draws talent and budget away from that legacy on-prem, usually enterprise, and into new, cool things that the Wall Street Journal are talking about. And it happens every single cycle with this. So yes, there is definitely a danger of over specialization. And to your point about, would we not be better off managing AI risks like we do other risks? Yes, the challenge I think we have is that we probably don't understand AI risks as well as we understand other types of risk that we have been essentially managing for longer, because this is so new. I was dealing in the film industry last year with the actors' strike, a huge part of which was about the use of AI. And Tom Hanks has said famously, I'll be making movies long after I'm dead. But of course, everyone breathed a sigh of relief when the actors' strike was called off, because they reached a settlement. That is going to have to be revisited in, I would say, 18 months, given how fast technology and AI is using. So I think we don't necessarily understand the risk as much as we do others. But I keep coming back to this legacy tech stack that is not getting the budget it needs. It's not getting the talent it needs because everyone's chasing the new cool thing. That's going to be a problem that we have to deal with for a very long period of time. But the danger is that we convince ourselves we've done an improvement by having a chief AI risk officer, and therefore it's all done. Just like we fix diversity with a diversity officer, just like we fix every problem with a brand new shiny toy that gets replaced every couple of years. I mean, we talked about this earlier, James. You see this, you talked about, you can trace it back, can't you? Every couple of years there is a brand new thing that people want to shout about.
Yeah, and Alice has a comment here in the chat. Tech debt is a huge elephant in the risk room. I think that like all of these examples, and we think about whether it's AI or whether we think about is CrowdStrike, now there's a lot of focus on like basic like development hygiene, technical hygiene around, whether it's third party risk management or whether it's even managing your internal controls. I think one thing that, and it's interesting to see is the feedback here in the poll about running exercises with your board. I think one thing that's unique to digital risk is that it affects everyone, and it's a massive, potentially, existential threat to organizations that poses very tangible, immediate impacts to the enterprise in a way that I think some of the manifestations of like physical risk are maybe a little more ambiguous or hypothetical or perceived hypothetical, right? So when you engage your boards or your executive team on digital risk, what are some of the key ways in which you can really get their attention? Because obviously you have some folks that are running exercises with their boards, some folks are not. But I think we get up to, daily examples of how digital risk is impacting organizations of all kinds. That really it's just a matter of when, not if. But if you had one recommendation for this group on how to better engage your executive team in these conversations, what would that be?
My advice would be that if this is the opportunity you have to give a once-in-a-lifetime TED talk to your board, don't talk about the program, don't talk about statistics, don't carry a clipboard, don't be that person because they're not interested. I'll share one experience that I had, and it was this. I got 15 minutes with the board, and I went in, I had no slides, I had nothing. I told them this. I said, I want you to never be comfortable with me being in your presence, but I'll make you a commitment. I'll never call you at the weekend for a chat. I'll never drop by your office on a whim just to say hi. But when I do show up, I need you to understand that something has gone wrong, and I'm going to need you to make very difficult decisions in the absence of clear data. That's going to be very uncomfortable. My job is to help you when that happens. Are you clear about what I'm asking you for? And there were other things that I went on to say, but essentially there was a pin drop in the room. I didn't talk about the program. I didn't talk about the regulator. I just said, me being in your eye line is not a good thing for you. Therefore, I need you to understand what I might ask you to do in this particular situation. Never talked about statistics because, quite frankly, I was never sure I believed in them. I've said this about statistics many, many times. You can prove anything with them. You can prove anything with a RAG status. I would always look at a RAG status and say, do you know what? I'm going to believe the reds because they're probably true. But everything that's green, I want to kick the tires on it because I don't believe that this is the case. So if you get the opportunity to deliver a TED talk, by all means, wow them with your story, but do not go in armed with statistics that don't necessarily mean anything. Tell them a story, engage with them. Human beings love being on the receiving end of stories. And let's not forget, storytelling didn't start as a linguistic construct. It started as a visual medium. We have cave paintings that predate language, so we know that this is true. But human beings really do engage with a story. And it had a very visceral effect on the board, because if they ever did see me accidentally in the corridor, there was this visceral, oh my God, has something happened? No, it's all right. It's just a coincidence. Don't worry about it. But I like what you're thinking. So my being in your eye line is not good. You need to get comfortable with that. And here's how, because I am not the bringer of good news. I won't even tell you that we've remediated this audit point or this regulatory point, because that's what you're paying me to do. When something goes wrong, which it will, this is what I want you to be able to do. I call it the spoon on glass moment. And there's one in every cycle of risk in every organization. At some point, I am going to bang a spoon on this glass as if I'm about to give a speech at a wedding, and you're going to have to take in everything that I'm about to tell you. That's probably not something that everybody can do, and you shouldn't copy me. You should be your own authentic selves. But think about it this way. You get the chance to deliver a TED Talk. What do you want them to take away with? And when we discussed this in prep, James, you said you were reminded of the walk the line thing. So maybe you want to just chime in on that, because I think that's making the same point, isn't it?
Yeah, so I don't know where this came from when we were talking last week, but I vividly remember this scene in the movie Walk the Line where Johnny Cash and his trio are in a recording studio recording some hackneyed song, and the producer's like, hold on. And he says what you can see on the screen here. Like, if you were hit by a truck and you were dying and you had one song left to sing, what would you sing? And to your point, if I'm in front of a board for the first and only time, am I going to say, well, we did the accounting BIA yesterday? I always think in the back of my head when I'm with executives or boards, so what? So when I say something in the back of my head, I'm like, so what? Why does this matter? And how is this relevant? And think about, well, I won't even go there. I'm going to use a different analogy. The first one's even too controversial for myself, so I'm going to self-edit in the real time. You're at a cocktail party and someone says, oh, what do you do? I'm in risk. Oh, what'd you do last week? Oh, I did a risk assessment. Like, would you say that at a cocktail party to get someone interested to talk to you? No. They'd be like, I don't even know. I need to go talk to someone else now. So why would you say that to your executives or your boards? Like, they don't care about metrics. And one of the reasons they don't care about metrics, if you've ever been in a board meeting or looked at a board packet, there's 300 pages of metrics. How are your metrics going to stand out? They're not. So yeah, I don't like putting metrics in board packets. I don't like using them in board meetings because it's a 2-day meeting or a 1-day meeting or a 4-day meeting. Your metrics are forgotten before you even leave the room. You need to tell that story that gets them thinking, yeah, this is important for this board, for this organization, and I'm going to remember this after lunchtime today.
I think it's having to your point, is that having the evidence to substantiate your argument, but make it meaningful to them. And then have that broader narrative. You don't necessarily have to go through the 50 pages of stats, right? But have done your homework to be able to dive into that level of detail as you're being asked to share. But don't start with that level of detail up front, because you quickly lose your audience. And some of these points, I had Gartner had recently come out with a report on the CrowdStrike issue. Or the outage, and some of what they had in that report I thought was really relevant to this conversation in terms of articulate the business impact, articulate the degree to which it has an impact on shareholder value, and simplify the story, because to both of your points, nobody really cares about all the detail. But I think the interesting part about the article from this morning was increasingly they have to be more concerned about the level of detail, because there is such ambiguity and the pace of change and everything that's the level of transformation that companies are undergoing is probably at a speed and a nature that we've never seen before. And so the board is feeling as if they need to control more of that. Now, whether or not that is a responsibility, I think that's a question mark, right? Is it that they need to own it, or do they need to trust the teams that are doing that today to be able to surface, to your point, Mark, around you're not going to see me all the time, but when you see me, there's going to be something that you need to pay attention to. And what's ideally in your mind, like, where have you seen this work well in terms of engaging with boards, and what is that relationship between boards, executive teams, and the risk and resilience teams kind of managing that level of technical detail?
Well, the most successful iteration I've ever seen was when the chief risk officer who sat on the board audit committee he owned one of the key remediation problems that the Federal Reserve had given to the organization. And the Fed believed that this institution had recidivist tendencies in which it kept making the same mistakes over and over again. And it was worried that we didn't have sufficient risk under governance. So the risk wasn't necessarily the risk, it's that it wasn't understood properly, it wasn't documented. But the iteration was successful because 15% of the chief risk officer's compensation was reliant on my success in fixing these problems. Now, that has a startling impact on focus. It is very difficult to change behavior unless you are impacting people's pocket. Now, I'm not suggesting that he wouldn't have taken it seriously had he not had 15%, but what I am suggesting is that I probably wouldn't have had as much one-to-one contact with him had his focus been elsewhere. But that's not always something that people can do. I think that one of the biggest issues is that, and James, you will have seen this, occasionally a board or an exec committee loses confidence in somebody, and it's just because they think, oh, we haven't got the right people, so let's fire everybody and get a brand new team in. Very often, it's not that the people they lose confidence in lack experience or lack technical understanding, is that they can't tell stories. They can't bring people on a journey. They can't communicate. They don't have gravitas in front of senior people. You see it so often. That's why consultants exist, because you're hiring the one thing that you haven't got internally, which is gravitas, the ability to stand up in front of a room of senior people and hold an audience. We don't teach that. And whenever I used to hire people, I would gravitate pretty much exclusively, because I am not an expert in anything other than being me. And I get that wrong often enough. But go and hire people who are smarter at policy. Go and hire people who are smarter at, crisis exercising or whatever it might be. But nobody was better than me at holding an audience. And very often when you get brought in and you look at this supposed mess that had been left behind by the people that weren't qualified or who had their confidence lost by the board, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the underlying program. It may have been slightly skewed in the wrong area, but it could have been course corrected quite quickly. But there's this snap, no, we need to get rid of a bunch of people. James, do you see that when you go in, you see executive committees have just lost confidence in the incumbents?
Yeah, absolutely. I usually get brought in for 3 reasons. 1, we want to assess where we are and grow. 2, we just want to understand where we are in relation to the industry and the world. But 3, we've had some type of event, a resume changing event for someone, and that person's been, let go. And most of the time, if it's a business continuity event, and you start looking at how did the person respond, how did the company tactically respond, it's pretty decent. It's very rare where it's just sheer incompetence or lack of preparations. Most times I find the thing you hear is, well, we lost confidence in so-and-so. Okay, why? Well, they wilted under pressure, or they, didn't do well in front of the board. It's not really, well, the building was on fire and they watched it burn. It's more often the board lost confidence, the CEO lost confidence. And to your point, they're not able to tell the story. Or more importantly, if you've ever been in board meetings, you want to talk about, squirrels. You come in thinking you're going to talk about X, and a board member asks you about Y. It's very hard to redirect a board back to the initial topic. If they want to go down a rabbit hole, you kind of have to let them, because they're your board of directors.
Yeah.
And that's where people, when they get outside their comfort zone, and I'm not saying make up stuff, but you have to be comfortable going in knowing we're in here to talk about this, and we may talk about this, that, or the other. Can you talk about that, address that, and try to redirect? But yeah, more often than not, it's the person's, what's that term we hear? Executive presence. They didn't have executive presence. It's not that they weren't technically capable.
Yeah, I once said to someone who said, "Can I just clarify, Mark? Is it your job then to make sure that this is being taken seriously?" And I said, "No, it's not. That's not my job at all. That's a complete misunderstanding of my job. My job is to make sure that you take all of this stuff seriously, because I am not the business. This is not my gig. It's not my rodeo. It's yours. So I will absolutely hold your feet to the fire, and I would expect nothing less in return." But just to expand that point you made about there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the program or what was done, and everybody suffers under pressure, of course, absolutely. But that's a fatal, if there is, and I love the phrase, what was it, resume changing, if that's often terminal. It's very difficult to recover from that, isn't it, from a reputational perspective?
Oh yeah, if you lose if your boss loses confidence in you, you need to be changing departments, jobs, companies. I've never seen someone who's like, man, I thought James was a complete moron, but then he gained my trust back. No, it's usually most of us, it's gone forever.
Yeah.
So
I see Mark Armour, you've had your hand raised for a bit.
Yeah, I posted the question in the chat. So I was curious about the example that Mark gave about the CRO's compensation being tied to his success in remediating the Federal Reserve findings. I was curious, was that actually done because of that repeated failure of those findings? There's something that's already in place, but okay.
Yes, 100% it was. And in the end, I think it was the right approach. And you could argue that is that motivated in the right way? I don't know. And I also don't care, because it got me so much time with this individual. He was my boss's. So I was head of operational resilience, reporting into the head of compliance and operational risk, who reported into the chief risk officer, who was sat on the board. So I was operating 2 levels above me on my own very, very frequently. And it was and each of the exco members owned 1 or 2 of these. I won't use the acronym because it won't mean anything to you, but they owned these top level risks, and their compensation was geared by the remediation program. So, it worked, but it's telling. It's like a golfer saying, "Oh, I'm really good at getting out of a bunker." Whereas actually, you shouldn't be in the bunker in the first place, right? Your initial drive off the tee should have been straight down the middle of the fairway. So you're measuring the wrong thing if you're saying we're really good in a crisis, or I'm really good out of the bunker, or I've got my full bonus because we remediated. That came about because we were constantly in the bunker. And in the end, the regulator just said, you've got a big problem. And once one regulator starts to say it, then the Bank of Japan, the JFSA, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the HKMA, everyone is essentially then saying the same things, and you create a much bigger problem for yourself. But yeah, that was because we kept ending up in the bunker.
I think the other thing that strikes me about this, based on some comments that both of you had made about sort of being the guy that you don't want to see, but I think there is this element of, and I mean, it kind of gets to kind of critical questions for the board that you see up on the screen. But at what point do we become, as an industry, do we become that go-to for more proactive scenario planning, where it isn't necessarily like you're the threatening guy in the room because something really bad has happened? It's about like, how do we work together to identify those scenarios that are most material to our organization so we can better prepare? And do you think that's a reality?
If I can conceive of it happening, it could happen. Now, it may be unlikely, and other things may be more likely. But if I could come up with it, how many times, and James, let me ask you this, how many times has something gone wrong in the news and you've read in Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or wherever, somebody said, we could never have predicted this. And I always step back and think, well, I'm pretty sure you could, and I think for me, the way to get ahead of the risk is actually to go, don't question it, right? If you think of, let's run 5 simulations in the next 2 hours, right? And let's just forget it. It's a breaking news story. So we've removed the fact that it probably won't happen. It has happened. If it did, what would you do? You could make more progress in that 2 hours than you could in any number of meetings about when was the last time we did the accounting, BIA? Because when it happens and you're not prepared, We need decision making, and we need it quickly. So, James, you must have had that, right? You must have heard people go, "We could never have predicted this," and so, actually, my friend, you probably could have predicted it.
Yeah, I mean, well, we always, I think all of us as humans, we look backwards, and so whatever the last known risk is what we're going to mitigate going forward, and then
100%.
we're myopic towards the next bump in the night. I think there's a fine line, though. I never want to be seen as Chicken Little, so the only time you see James is when the sky is falling.
Yeah.
Because I think just human nature, then they're like, oh man, every time James shows up, he has bad news. I'm just going to duck him. I want people to think every time James shows up, he has something important or relevant to share. Might be good, might be bad, might be something to think about, but I'm not wasting people's time. And I always try to, like, just, psychologically with executives, if we're scheduled for an hour, I'm going to be done in 45 minutes. If we're scheduled in 30 minutes, I'm going to be done in 20. I would rather die, honestly, than go over time, because we're all now looking at, like, if this webinar went 3 hours, how many people would drop off or be like, seriously, what's happening here? Just psychologically, I want to end. I will always end early, whether it's 8 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, 2 hours, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Don't ever ask for 2 minutes of somebody's time and then pull out a 35 slide deck.
Yeah.
Because again, the next time you ask for their time, they're going to say no.
It's a very good point. And I would always reframe the conversation as hey, I'm not testing, I'm partnering. I want you to see me as a very valued partner, so that you start to ask my opinion on other things that could potentially go wrong, especially if I was able to focus in on the way the specific nature of the risk led to a balance sheet problem. So as an example, within financial services, if you have process flows in investment banking that don't work, then under some regulators, you are forced to ring-fence balance sheet just in case that risk did manifest itself in a problem. They knew that you would have the money to sort yourself out. Well, of course, if I can fix the underlying problem, that's balance sheet that I'm able to free up, that you can trade on. In terms of your own business. So that's not me talking about a technology problem. That's can I have 5 minutes to tell you how I can free up $80 million worth of balance sheet if you give me the following mandate? All of a sudden, wow, that's a completely different conversation, right?
So it's interesting. I think some of this, curious about how this might correlate to failure of imagination. I brought up this example, which I found super interesting. So if you look back at the CrowdStrike outage, it actually has roots in a decision that was made back in 2009. So apparently there was a decision around a Windows antitrust issue in 2009 that ultimately allowed security vendors to have access to the kernel layer of Windows. So the same access that Microsoft has to the kernel layer, security vendors also had that access. And the intent was really around fostering competition in the industry. And the assumption was that security vendors basically have their stuff together, right? Enough that they wouldn't pose a threat to the security, of the operating system. So obviously that, many years later panned out to be a false assumption. But humans are notoriously terrible at predicting long tail risk like this. And granted, like, this is a multifaceted issue. A lot of things contributed, but the two of you, exceptionally creative individuals, I think this does get to sort of the right brain, left brain aspect of effective risk management, storytelling, making it meaningful for people. What are the tangible things that you think teams can be doing to bring some of this long tail risk, or looking at some of the broader considerations based on whether it's regulatory decisions or decisions the organization is making, like really bringing that to life for organizations so that they can be more effective at managing that risk?
For me, just because you put this up about the antitrust problem, we should make it clear that the outage wasn't a technology related problem, in the sense that it had nothing really to do with the fact that CrowdStrike had access to the kernel, but it had everything to do with the fact that they weren't doing canary testing and that someone was able to make a change that then got propagated elsewhere. That's essentially, that's a cultural issue. That's a training problem. That's a process problem that's wrapped up in a technical issue. And I think that very often we leap to talking about widgets and code and servers and you know, all manner of component parts. And actually, we're not, and what the regulators want in a lot of industries is for companies to understand the impact of an outage on the consumer in a language and vocabulary that consumer would understand. And essentially, this is the problem that we've got here. It looks like it's a technology problem, but how was somebody able to make a change and that get propagated? So actually, you could argue that that's not, I agree with you, we should be looking at long-tail risk, but actually, giving them access to the kernel, that only allowed them to then make another mistake that ended up with the technology problem. So I think it's inevitable that, you know, CrowdStrike, and I know we talked last week about Delta and the impact that had. The chief executive of both of those organizations are going to end up in the House. There's probably going to be a massive class action lawsuit at some point.
Yeah, that was another newsworthy headline from this week. They're looking at the role of the board in terms of their fiduciary responsibilities and did they do what they needed to do. So I mean, I think all of this really hangs together. I think the other thing out of this is that, particularly as you think about the relationship between technical teams and boards and executives and just the very nature of their engagement, you know, do we design technical systems that look resilient or are they actually resilient? James, what are your thoughts?
Well, as a Delta customer who tried to fly for 5 days, I was not a fan of the CrowdStrike outage. And someone mentioned in the chat what I liked about the CrowdStrike outage. It certainly showed why risk appetite is important. I had clients who do not allow automatic updates, regardless of whether it's a cyber vendor or not, and didn't go down. I work with companies who have everything fully automated, updated, and they were bricked. So it shows why risk appetite is important. It was also a masterclass in terrible crisis management to me. The CrowdStrike CEO that first morning was on Good Morning America. I would think that's one of the most easiest interviews you could do. They asked him questions that totally threw him off kilter. And I was thinking, how were you not prepared for the two obvious softball questions you were going to get from Good Morning America, not really known as a hard-hitting news source in the United States? My good buddy Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta, flying to Paris for the Olympics while his world was burning. Probably not a great idea. To Mark's point, he will be answering those questions in a House committee meeting. And I think it got a lot of companies thinking about, it's always been hard for me to explain fourth or nth party risk to a board or to executive. They just assume, well, Microsoft's infallible, my cybersecurity is infallible. So anything that, like, why would we even think fourth or fifth or nth party? Who cares? Now they know why that matters. I work with one company where CrowdStrike is like a tiny thing for a vendor to a vendor to a vendor. Like you would never even think about it. And it knocked out part of their ability to service their customers. They never would have considered like nth party risk as a risk. And they certainly are now. But yeah, I think like Mark said, you know, these companies that automatically deploy, that don't have canary, that have access to your systems, is probably not a great idea. So.
And I find it, the Delta thing I think is particularly interesting because there has been absolutely no quarter given from the DOT to Delta. Because
which I'm thankful for because I got my money back biasly.
Yeah, because am I right, James, that they weren't initially going to do that because they were claiming it was somebody else's fault and the DOT reversed that decision.
Correct. They said that, well, you know, we don't have to give refunds or we don't have to provide assistance to you if you're stuck in an airport. And the US Department of Transportation was very aggressive that, yes, you do have to make these people whole. And as a public company for Delta, that's going to be a huge hit. I'm very curious when their quarterly, their Q3 financials come out, late October. That's going to be a massive hit, and that will drive their board's attention. You want to talk about shareholder value? We've mentioned that earlier. Look at CrowdStrike's share price the last month. And if you're an executive that has compensation tied to that, you're not getting your bonus this year, or you're making a lot less money than you were last year. That will, you take anyone's wallet, that gets their attention.
But another thing about that, the Delta issues, is that they're, so the issues that they had experienced were actually very similar to what Southwest experienced just a few years ago.
Correct.
In that the employee, essentially how they assign resources, there is no real contingency for that system. So you're doing ridiculous things like using the airport intercom to locate pilots and flight attendants, and like, so they're patching together a system. But I think that points to another thing in the industry is like, we fail to learn from one another. Like, why learn from, I mean, this is NVIDIA CEO has been talking a lot about, why not learn from other people's mistakes? Like, why do we have to experience them before we learn them for ourselves? And so he's very in favor of, which I think has a lot to do with what we do with after action reporting. Like, let's make these failures public so that we don't repeat, the same sort of mistakes. And I brought up this slide because I think it also reinforces the point here is to, there's a lot of uncertainty that we're all experiencing. I think there's a lack of understanding as to what best practice should be in these scenarios. I think you have a lot of pockets in the organization that are trying to figure this out for themselves, including boards and executives. So this is the role of, risk, resilience, compliance to really, to show the way effectively. Now, there are some other interesting observations with some of these stats in terms of rationalization, people deliberately deciding not to do the right thing or what they perceive to be, the right thing. And then, of course, the situation of malice. But I thought it was very interesting, and I think it speaks to the challenge that we experience in compliance training or even best practices training as to what to do in these sorts of scenarios. Mark Armour, I see your hand raised.
So yeah, I definitely see examples of all of these. Is a lot of this just driven by poor incentives or poor culture with I keep thinking back to, I don't know if you guys remember, several years ago, Wells Fargo was in deep trouble because employees were creating all of these accounts for customers. Well, because they were incentivized to create new accounts. Right. And that incentive was stronger than the incentive they were provided via their training, that they have to comply and do all these other things.
Well, they were also in the news more recently. It was over their employees they had fired a group of employees because they found that these employees were using the software that keeps you active. I forget what they call the software, but essentially, to indicate that they're active on their desktop. And so they fired the employees because they said they violated corporate policy, but there were a lot of questions swirling around, well, how are you incentivizing your employees, right? Because ultimately, if they're getting the job done or they're performing effectively, but what you're measuring and managing is, whether they're active or not on Teams and Slack, what's the message there? And I think that's also, to some of your points around managing values, managing culture. What are the things that you want to reward people for? Because that ultimately does build the culture of your organization.
If you're partnering, back to James's point about being a useful partner and trusted advisor, if you're partnering, and if there is anyone on from financial services, I would encourage you to do this, although it does extend to other verticals. If you look at CrowdStrike at the moment and what's happening to them, there should be in a major financial services organization, and I don't know who this is, but somebody banks CrowdStrike. Somebody has underwritten their corporate banking. Somebody has lent them money. Somebody has given them investment banking products, et cetera, et cetera. The conversations going on within the business side of the financial services organization for whom CrowdStrike is a client. And then you've got the technical people over here for whom CrowdStrike is a supplier. Those conversations need to be joined up because you need to have a sort of whole of life view of your relationship with CrowdStrike. So I would always encourage people to say, when something happens to somebody else, you should always ask yourself, could this have happened to us? Or what would it have needed for us to have been impacted by this? But also, what is the entirety of our relationship with this supplier? Because we tend to navigate to this being a supplier problem. They are a supplier to us, they have screwed up, therefore we need to do something. But what if they're also a client? And very often those two things are not joined up. And I think that plays to your long tail risk point more, Paula, which is that actually you need to be taking a joined up view. And that's not an operational resilience thing, but that is resilience partnering with the business to say, hey, we need to have a look at this because we need to understand the full nature of our exposure to this customer so that we can work out what the potential risk to us might be.
So one more question, because I know we're up against time. What is the role of scenarios in really joining up that conversation, in your opinion?
Well, for me, it takes it from the abstract to the concrete. So if you were to last 2 months ago, if you were to talk to a board of directors about nth party risk, that's abstract. If you were to build a scenario similar to CrowdStrike outage, that is tangible. So when you do scenario testing, for me, it's two things. One, getting people to work together under pressure. And then two, doing something that's, they can relate it back to and it shows relevance.
Yeah, I love that phrase, from the abstract to the concrete. I'll give you one example from many years ago, when Russia invaded Crimea. The organization that I worked for had a crisis call because of what was happening in the foreign exchange market, not because they thought that we had a problem that we needed to solve that was anything other than a business problem. And I attended the meeting, and they said, "This is a foreign exchange conversation. Why are you here?" I said, "Because you do know that there are 300 people in the Crimean region that support the primary investment banking data center systems. And they didn't because they were an nth party supplier." And they said, "Well, we don't have anyone in that part of the world." I was like, "Well, not that we paid directly, but that we do have a huge reliance on that." Had that been wrapped up as a scenario, that may have prompted, where may we have an exposure to this? And I think the biggest and quickest way of adding value to a resilience program is through scenario testing and simulations, because it forces people to think about what they might do. Therefore, when it inevitably does happen, they've at least been through the process a couple of times. And it may well give you a mandate that you'd never get, to James's point, if you wander in telling them when the accounting VIA was last updated. So I think scenario and simulations has a huge part to play in driving that partnership together.
Yeah, I think going back to the article, that was exactly the point that they were making, and that boards need to story live these moments to effectively know how they would respond and effectively govern the organization in a direction that is coherent, with their values. So I know we're right up against time. I feel like we could probably carry on for another hour or two, but if you're interested in bringing an AI scenario to life for your leadership, we do offer free micro simulations. Just scan the QR code that'll take you to a page where you can select the microsim that you're interested in. The other thing of note, we have a campaign of War Game to Game Day events. That is, we just had our last event was in Melbourne, Australia. We also had a Sydney event, really spectacular conversations around these emerging risks. We're having one upcoming in Dallas, in Washington, DC, and London. So if you're interested in attending one of those, they're free to attend. Go ahead and scan the QR code. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Fantastic conversation. James, Mark, spectacular as always. Always appreciate your insights. And we will see you on the next, and Mark Armour, thanks for all your contributions as well. But we will see you on the next one.